As I invite Shaykh to address the Mu'mineen, I ask you guys to move closer to create a warm reception. Bahar Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Yes. Ma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let us all recite a Surah Fatiha and 3 times Surah Ikhlas for the marhumin of tonight's sponsors. Sayyid S. Muhammad Shah, the family of Ali Rizwan Shah and Sabra Batul and family, and Dr. Haider Ali Mithani, son of Manji Bhai Mithani, Mehboob Mithani and family.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. Begin in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. We ask that He send abundant blessings upon our noble Prophet Muhammad al-Mustafa, upon his immaculate family, and the elect of his companions. Ameen. Brothers and sisters, family, friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's an honor to be here with everybody this evening. It's an honor on my part to have been invited by Shaykh Mahdi and the organizers. So please do keep the organizers of CFK and every other organization in Dallas in your du'as, because we know, especially if you are an organizer, you know, but we should all know how much effort and time goes into organizing these programs. So do keep them in your du'as on a regular basis, inshallah ta'ala. So we are here to memorialize the life of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam and his grandson Al-Hasan al-Mujtaba alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And what we want to do over the next 2 nights is talk about one of the major components or one of the major tools that the Prophet provided for us. And of course, all of the Imam Ali and all of their children and so forth, they also continued to teach, because everything, of course, that comes from the Prophet is what is guarded by the Imams thereafter. Now, at least for me, I can say for sure that when I think about the death of the Prophet, then I'm thinking about the death of my spiritual father. When I think about the death of the Prophet, I do think about a bodily death, but I also think about a continued legacy that enriches my life, that enriches the lives of the people that I surround myself with, and that continues to live on to this day. So while we are speaking about the memorializing of a death, we are also reminding ourselves, or remembering, and this is the point of the memorialization, reminding ourselves of the continued living legacy of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And that continued legacy depends, partially, on us. That continued legacy depends on us continuing to live out his teachings. His teachings are not just enshrined in some document placed on the wall, but they are lived out by the Muslim Ummah as a whole. Of course, the sum total or the peak manifestation of those teachings, of course, is embodied in the Imam of our time, and may God hasten his reappearance. But until then, we are all actors in the living legacy of the Prophet's teachings. And so, of course, we cannot look at the entirety of his teachings. Right? No lifetime can encompass that. But tonight and tomorrow, we'll be speaking about the concept of silence, samt, and how the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam taught us how to actualize our spiritual and mental powers through a particular tool, the particular tool of silence. When God speaks about the Prophet in the Quran, Surah Al-Jum'ah, Ayah 2, هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة. And God says that He is the one, meaning God, is the one who brought up from amongst the unlettered people a prophet from themselves. And then He mentions 4 reasons why. يتلو عليهم آياته. In order to recite to the people, and in effect to us, His signs, God's signs. Ayatihi, yani ayatullah. And to yuzakihim, to purify them. And thus, the Prophet was sent to purify us. وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. And to teach them the book, most likely the Quran, but their mufassirun talk about what other possibilities this book may be. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. To teach us the book and to teach us wisdom, hikmah. Okay? And so we'll be looking tonight about how silence plays a role in hitting all of those 4 points. Silence plays a role in us understanding the ayats of God, the signs of God, both in a lafzi sense, in a linguistic sense, and in a sense in the terms of meaning, a ma'nawi sense, a eternal manifestation of God's graces upon us. We'll talk about how silence helps us to purify ourselves, and that silence helps us to learn the book of God, and perhaps the book of creation, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and how silence helps us to understand hikmah, how to become wise as individuals. So before we do that, I just want to give one more kind of framework for some of the effects of silence that we want to take away from these 2 discussions. Hopefully, again, these will be practical. This is not going to be, at least I hope, it won't be just a theoretical discussion. There are 4 takeaways that I hope we'll be able to take from these. One is that silence is a tool that will help us avoid various forms of disobedience, various forms of sin. 2, silence has a dunyawi role to play as well. It has dunyawi effects. So when we talk about silence keeping us from sin, then we're hoping for ukhrawi effects. We're hoping for salvation in the hereafter, things from the akhirah. But silence also has something to help us with in the dunya. That is that it helps develop a good reputation amongst other people. 3, silence will help protect our friendships and our relationships. And then 4, and this will really be touched on more tomorrow, but a little bit tonight, the silence opens our hearts and our minds up to various forms of knowledge and worship. Okay, so silence has both dunyawi and ukhrawi, meaning temporal in this world effects, and eternal in the akhirah effects. Okay, so this is something we should all be excited about trying to grab onto, because we're not just waiting until our deaths to see the fruit of our acts, but inshallah we'll also see positive effects in this world. So the first level that we want to speak about is silencing the tongue. Okay. The Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam is recorded, salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, is narrated to have said, Man samata naja. Or in another narration, another recension, Man samata salima. That one who is silent is safe. Really what this means is one who has habituated themselves to holding back their tongues, one who has habituated themselves to silence, not just one who is silent in a particular instant, but they are normally quiet. They are naja, they are safe. It's the opposite of annihilated, halaka. One who is silent is safe. What does that even mean? often when we talk about things like silence, or we talk about ideas of like sins of the tongue, we probably sort of minimize these things as pithy aphorisms. Yeah, there's sins of the tongue, there's not a really big deal. We're really concerned with big picture ideas like oppression and justice, and these things are what kind of gets us going. But when we think about something as small as the tongue, or if we think of lisan in Arabic, it means tongue, but really we're talking about the whole apparatus of communication, the mouth. Okay, all of the muscles that play a role in these sounds that I'm formulating to you today. There's a bunch of small little muscles that are all moving at different rates to produce different sounds. Somehow they're intelligible to you. And these sounds are also often unique. If you think about it, most of you don't have the same exact voice. You can tell somebody's voice because it's a particular noise or a particular sound unique to them. That's why people who can do, what do they call it? When somebody can kind of mimic another person's voice? Ventriloquist? Impressions is what I'm looking for. Right, on Saturday Night Live or whatever, people who can mimic Obama's voice, that we think that's impressive because we're all unique in terms of our voice. It's hard to mimic another person's voice. This little thing in the mouth, this tongue, is really miraculous. If we just take a moment to think about it, how is it that you understand anything that I'm saying? What is language? What is communication even? This thing in my mouth is able to communicate a constellation of meanings that are in my mind, which is also miraculous that we can even think about thought. But this muscle in my mouth is able to communicate a constellation of meanings to you, and you to me. So the tongue is not just kind of a small element. It actually has incredible power. On a theoretical level, the way I just put it, that we can communicate incredible ideas to one another, but it also has incredible real-life positive and negative effects. When we say that هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسول منهم يتلو عليهم آياته, to do tilawa, the Prophet was sent to speak to us. The Prophet was sent to communicate ideas through the tongue to us. The Prophet was meant to bring his tongue to guide us from darkness to light, to guide us from dalala to hidayah. The tongue does that. Yes, we could have imagined that simply a text does it, but the Quran is qira'ah, it's recitation. That tongue is doing the miracle of hidayah. The tongue is able to organize society and lead society toward a goodly end. In other words, you can't have politics without communication. And we often think of politics in a negative way. But politics, insofar as it produces good outcomes for us, and maybe that may be rare, but politics is primarily a function of communication, a function of the tongue. The tongue is able to communicate love between people, to a child, to a parent, to a friend, to a spouse. Most of us, I can't at least, can't really understand what love is anyway. I mean, as an abstract idea, what is love anyway? But somehow our tongues can communicate these feelings deep within us to another entity, to another being. Whether that be feelings of protection, whether that be feelings of, guardianship. Thank you, brother. Thank you. Whether that be feelings of appreciation or feelings of infatuation. You know that when you're a newlywed or whatever, you don't know what you're feeling, but somehow you're able to put into words something to another person. And that makes them feel, likewise, close to you, hopefully, unless it's unrequited love. But that's a miracle, in my mind, at least. And then the tongue is able to transfer confidence from one individual to another. Young families struggle with this with their children. How do I give confidence to my child? It's through speech. It's through basic communication. And that's reductive to say basic communication. Again, it's miraculous to say you can do it. To say that I believe in you can change the listener's state altogether from a feeling of lowliness, a feeling of loneliness, to a feeling of, okay, confidence, of capability, of courage. You can instill courage just through words. Or again, in a positive sense. We had the Martyrdom before this. That language, the tongue, the mouth, can communicate virtuous sadness between individuals. In fact, these gatherings are based on communication of the tongue, of these miracles. Now, the flip side is also true. The tongue can confuse, fake news and all that. The tongue can bring people from light into darkness. The tongue can break people. As a person involved in community relationships, I see a lot of this. People who are suffering from the trauma of emotional abuse from when they were children. That is suffering from the pain and the torment of somebody else's tongue. Often, the torment of a family member's tongue, of a parent's tongue. And it can lead to the need for years or decades of counseling, of therapy, the lack of self-confidence, and so on. So the tongue is miraculous in both its capacity to heal and uplift people, and in the capacity to destroy, to harm, to cut people down. And so that's kind of just an overview of the power of the tongue, and the miraculousness of this idea of communication. But man samata naja, and one who is silent is safe. Safe from what? So we'll list a few of the major sins that stem from the tongue, and then we'll talk about silencing the mind to close us out. First of all, there's some obvious ones. Idea of ghiba, backbiting, buhtan, slander. Right? These are two of the major sins of our religion. To backbite is to do what? It's not to say something wrong about somebody. It's to say something that's actually true about another person behind their back that they wouldn't want you to mention. Right? Sometimes you hear this confusion. People say, I'll tell it to their face. That doesn't matter if you'll tell it to their face. Or it's actually true. That doesn't make it okay. Ghiba is something true about somebody that they wouldn't want you to share with somebody else, but then you go and you share it with them. Okay? Buhtan is slander, where you make something up about somebody that's not true in order to insult or demean them behind their back. Okay? Both are major sins. Ghiba, at least in my experience, a lot of people are not like trying to go out and gossip about people. Some people, that's like a pastime. Right? That's kind of put those people aside. But most people are not like trying to gather in order to talk down about people. But it's often something that kind of slips. It's something that comes out. You analyze yourself. If you ever commit the sin, and God protect us from it, there's often a feeling that comes up from the hawa, from the nafs. There's an agitation, or for some people, it's something almost positive. It's almost like adrenaline. We kind of get excited, and then we say something we feel like we shouldn't have said. Man samata naja. When we're used to holding back our opinions about other people, when we make that a habit, then we're a lot safer. But if we're used to kind of talking around the edges and speaking about our opinions about other people, it's easy to kind of slip just a little bit, and now we're in ghiba territory. We're in backbiting territory. Okay? So that's why this idea of habituation of the tongue to silence is of particular use. Of course, mockery and insults. When we talk about sin, we often don't think about things like mocking people or insulting people, especially in our society where sarcasm is like very normal. And sarcasm, it's part of our humor, we're kind of used to it. But if you talk to your friends, or maybe you know it yourself, maybe somebody was a little too sarcastic and you kind of have a grudge against them because it actually hurts you. And so that moment of sarcasm that was intended to be a joke, if it hurts you or if you hurt somebody else, that's actually a sin. Because one of the things the Prophet came to do was to bring people together. And of course, insulting, even if it's meant to be a joke, kind of, but not really, that breaks people apart. And it might be a death by 1,000 cuts type of issue. Right? It's not like I'm telling you off and you never want to speak to me again. But, you might have had a friend or somebody you've been around where they were just a little too sarcastic, a little too often, and you don't really want to be around that person anymore. This runs contrary to the whole ethos of the prophetic life, to bring the Muslim Ummah together as a whole. Of course, lying, major sin. That's something we deal with as children, or as parents, we tell our kids, don't lie to me. And so that's kind of basic. But where lying seems to come in a lot is kind of in business deals, kind of cut corners. We say something on a contract we don't intend. We're trying to engage in some sort of deal and we kind of push the edge. We're trying to gain the edge rather, and we say something that's not really truthful in order to close the deal, for instance. And we know it's not going to affect things in the end, but we're kind of putting ourselves out there a little bit too cleanly, right? In order to, get the mortgage or whatever it is you're looking to do, right? So in business, lying becomes a bit of a tricky thing to deal with. And then in jest, again, we dealt with the issue of sarcasm. Humor is something that's a little bit tricky. Our fuqaha kind of argue about, can you lie while in jest, right? Can I tell a lie to make a joke? And some scholars say that's okay. It's not great to do because we have a hadith that forbid it. But some say it's not an actual forbiddance, but it's makruh. It's disliked to do. And some scholars say, no, even lying in jest is a problem. So you can't, we live in like a prank culture where we watch these videos of people who say like, oh, the cat died. And then the cat didn't die and it's supposed to be funny, but it's really sad at the same time. That kind of jest is problematic Islamically, right? Where you tell somebody that, my car broke down, it's supposed to be a funny prank. You've seen hopefully not the TikToks, but the YouTubes and the Instagrams and whatever. So lying in jest is a bit of a problem. And again, it runs contrary to this idea of habituating ourselves to silence, or if we want to frame it slightly differently, habituating ourselves to useful and productive speech. And that's kind of the implication of silence, is that we only speak when useful and productive. You ever had a class, or perhaps a classmate or a colleague, where they always seem to have the answer? Maybe it's a philosophy 101 class and there's somebody in class who like always thinks they know something, but they really don't know a whole lot at all. We say in English, right, that person talks too much, right? Like we denigrate people like that, even in our culture, even not as Muslims, right? We kind of roll our eyes when their hands up to every answer, to every question rather, and they don't really know what they're saying. Or maybe you have a work colleague who always has an idea, but the idea is really flimsy all the time, right? And yeah, they're on the team, but they're kind of sidelined a lot. But they're really confident in their ideas. This creates a dunyawi naqs, a dunyawi deficiency. Right? If you're that person who always thinks they know the answer, maybe cut back on that a little bit. Because other people see that in a negative light. And this is kind of sensitive in our culture, I think, But one of the things that we're trying to do as Muslims is also to present ourselves well. We want to present ourselves as dignified people. And insofar as being quick to answer every question decreases our dignity in other people's eyes, that's something we need to avoid. Not to mention the fact that if you think you know the answer but you have no basis for that answer, that's a sin. Okay? We have a hadith that say that if somebody answers a religious question and they answer it correctly, the conclusion is correct, but they have no basis for their answer. In other words, they didn't do their due diligence, they didn't do the research. That's a sin. The answer was correct, the conclusion was correct, the process was a problem. Man samata naja. One who is silent is safe. Okay? So, again, a dunyawi and ukhrawi benefit, a temporal and eternal benefit. We don't look silly if we always have an answer that's really not a very good answer. And then we don't have to face God and God says, why did you always think you had the answer and you were trying to guide people but you had no idea? Right? So dunyawi, a temporal and an eternal benefit. And then this is something I think we've all had some experience with. The friend who makes too many promises and maybe fulfills 25% of them. They're coming from a sincere place. They always want to help you to do X, Y, and Z. They say, yeah, we're going to solve this problem together, or I'm going to help you, unload your U-Haul or whatever, but they're never really there. That's something we need to avoid if that's us. That's considered a deficiency in akhlaq. It's not, if you're making false promises you don't intend to hold at all, that's a sin. But if you're really sincere and you really do want to help them, but you never really get around to it very often, if you measure up your completion rate, if it's really low, don't make the promise. If you can help them unload the U-Haul one day, great, go. But don't make the promise if you're never really able to fulfill that promise. Okay? We have a hadith that forbid even pretending like you have grass or oats for a mule and calling a mule to you if you don't have oats with you. Even that kind of making promises you can't keep, even to an animal, is considered forbidden. One of our ulama mentioned this, I won't mention who, but mentioned this to a politician because he said, don't make promises you can't keep to the people. You can't even make a promise you can't keep to a mule. Man samata naja. And then the last one I'll mention, just because we don't talk about it very often, is publicly praising people too much. Sounds like a good thing. I should publicly praise people around me. I should tell people about how awesome so-and-so is, and the more I do it, the better. But we have a hadith that indicate, and this bears out, we don't need a hadith to tell us this bears out in real life, that can create the potential for istikbar. This creates the potential for arrogance. If I'm always saying how amazing so-and-so is over and over and over again, they begin to actually think it. Even if you were kind of going over the top just to be their friend or just to give them some confidence, that can go overboard. So these are various sins of the tongue, or not all sins, but deficiencies of the tongue, things that develop poor character, either as the speaker or even sometimes as a listener, because listening to backbiting, for instance, is also haram. But here we're speaking primarily about the speaker. Now, in our day and age, with things like this, we need to extend this principle of silence to silence of the thumbs, right? Most of our communication, perhaps, I don't know if it's quite the majority, but a huge chunk of our communication is done virtually. The sharing of information is instantaneous and overwhelming, right? And the hijab, the the barrier of the computer screen can allow our communication to be that much more relentless. You just read the comments at the bottom of news articles or YouTube or Instagram posts or whatever. Criticism is that much sharper online. It's that much uglier. We've probably all, again, God save us from this, but we probably all remember posts that we wished we hadn't posted, or texts that we wish we hadn't sent, or a text that we wish we had formulated just a little bit more softly, because with virtual communication comes a larger degree of misunderstanding. If I put a period, it seems like it's harsh almost. If I don't put an exclamation point, it seems like I'm unhappy. Right? There's new norms of communication virtually. And so one way we can deal with that is to criticize it and say that shouldn't be a problem. The other way to deal with it is to say we have a larger need to be careful. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Take just a break. So.
Yes, brothers, the young brother seems to be fine. Dr. Bilal is taking care of him. Inshallah, we'll conclude our program with the Matam. Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. Requesting Brother Adnan and Brother Hadi. Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल हर तमाचे पे सकीना ने, हर तमाचे पे सकीना ने पुकारा बाबा, अब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा है, जब मुझे हर तमाचे पे सकीना ने, हर तमाचे पे सकीना ने पुकारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल अरे मुझे बालों से पकड़ के तमाचे मारे, मुझे बालों से पकड़ के तमाचे मारे, मैंने सरशे से मांगा जो तुम्हारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आप हाँ, जब मुझे आपके कातिल है, वो जो दुरिया अपने तोहफे में मुझे बख्शे थे, वो जो दुरिया अपने तोहफे में मुझे बख्शे थे, उनको बेदर्दी से जालिम ने उतारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे है जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा, आए आपके सीने पे आराम से सोने वाली, आपके सीने पे आराम से सोने वाली, सो के अब खाक पे करती है गुजारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने अल्तमाचे पे सकीना ने, अल्तमाचे पे सकीना ने पुकारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, ऐ सात रहवारों के दौड़ाया गया है मुझको, सात रहवारों के दौड़ाया गया है मुझको, चूर जख्मों से बदन मेरा है सारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल है मारा, है नो के नेज़ा पे उसे देखूं तो देखूं कैसे, नो के नेज़ा पे उसे देखूं तो देखूं कैसे, मेरा असग़र था मुझे जान से प्यारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, है वो जो दुनिया अपने तोहफे में मुझे बख्शे थे, वो जो दुनिया अपने तोहफे में मुझे बख्शे थे, उनको बेदर्दी से जालिम ने उतारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल ने है मारा बाबा, जब मुझे आपके कातिल है मारा बाबा, या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन या हुसैन,
बेखता मारा गया सिबते रसूले दोसरा, वाहसन सब्ज़ कबा, बेखता मारा गया सिबते रसूले दोसरा, वाहसन सब्ज़ कबा, बेखता मारा गया सिबते रसूले दोसरा, वाहसन सब्ज़ कबा, जहर से टुकड़ जिगर खून से कफन लाल हुआ, वाहसन सब्ज़ कबा, बेखता मारा गया सिबते रसूले दोसरा, वाहसन सब्ज़ कबा, बेखता मारा गया सिबते रसूले दोसरा, वाहसन सब्ज़ कबा, गलते हुए भाई को बहन ने देखा और तड़प के ये कहा, और तड़प के ये कहा, तेरी गुर्बत पे भाई तेरी ज़ैनब हो फिदा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा। माँ के दुख से अभी आज़ाद कहाँ थी ज़ैनब, हो गया कैसा गज़ब, हो गया कैसा गज़ब, बाप जिंदा न रहा भाई सुबह खुल्द गया, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, कर दिया ज़हर हला गले जिगर के टुकड़े, और कासिम के लिए, और कासिम के लिए, कम सिनी में है ये गम शाम गरीबा जैसा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा। शैने उस वक्त जो गाजी को न रोका होता, हश्र हो जाता बपा, हश्र हो जाता बपा, तीर आते न जना जे पे तुम्हारे मौला, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा। शैने रेहान शेख ओ रेहान बरादर का जिगर याद आया, जब सरे कैब बला, जब सरे कैब बला, टुकड़े कासिम के उठाते हुए मौला ने कहा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा, बेखता मारा गया सिब्ते रसूले दूसरा, वाह हसन सब्ज़ क़बा।
Requesting Brother Hussain to please recite Ziyarat Masumi. Sallallahu alayka ya Rasulullah, Assalamu alayka ya Nabi Allah, Assalamu alayka Aliyan Amir al-Mu'minin, Sayyid al-Wasiyin, Assalamu alayka ya Fatima al-Zahra, Sayyidat al-Nisa al-Alamin, Assalamu alayka Aba Muhammad, Hasan ibn Ali, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah al-Husayn, Assalamu ala al-Husayn, wa ala Ali ibn al-Husayn, wa ala awlad al-Husayn, وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليكم يا مولاتنا زينب بنت علي وأم كلثوم بنت علي وسكينة بنت الحسين. السلام عليكم يا مولا أبو الفضل العباس يا ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم أئمة الهدى من ذرية الحسين. السلام عليكم يا مولاي علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن العسكري. السلام عليك مولاي صاحب العصر والزمان. الأمان 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 يا مولاي خليفة الرحمن، يا مولاي يا إمام الإنس والجان. عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله صل على
Okay. I know how he is in the head. I was like, man, that's probably possible.
Not for long.
Alhamdulillah, I'll be your chauffeur, so whenever you're
Yes.
I don't know if that'd be a good question. Oh. I didn't know that. Well, another hidden secret is exactly. Know each other from.
Okay. Yeah, so inshallah.
If you're planning to take him for lunch, let us know because I think I want to do something.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely. This is his food.
All right. Tomorrow?
No, no, not.
Oh.
Then
We
I'll
both get
call you
some.
and like,
I was gonna do it, but you're taking him.
don't have any plans. No, no.